When I was asked to interview Dr. Gingrich-Philbrook for a spotlight panel at this conference, I felt enormous pressure to get things right. In preparation for this panel, we wanted to provide a healthy mix of depth, humor, and heart. To that end, we agreed on a format initially designed by James Lipton, the late actor and Dean Emeritus of the Actors Studio at Pace University. Welcome to our edition of Inside the Autoethnographer's Studio. Today's guest is a professor of communication studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and former editor of Text and Performance Quarterly. Like so many of us drawn to performance studies and autobiographical scholarship, Craig was both a forensics practitioner and coach. Judges ready. He received his BA and MA from California State University, Chico, and his PhD from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, where he currently works and specializes in performance studies. His many accolades include the Southern States Communication Association Performance Scholar of the Year distinction, the Central States Communication Association's Performance and Theater Outstanding Scholar of the Year, the NCA Performance Studies Distinguished Service Award, and the NCA Irene Koger Award for Excellence in Performance, along with numerous other deserved prizes. Dr. Gingrich-Philbrook is the author of roughly 50 essays in professional journals and books. He has also written, performed in, and directed numerous live performances and solo shows, including 2013's The Last Giraffe, 2009's Still Life, 2005's Exit Strategy, 1995's Refreshment, and 1995's Gap, among many other productions. Autoethnographers probably best know Dr. Gingrich-Philbrook from works like Autoethnography's Family Values and Autoethnography in an Almond Grove. He is the most consistently kind and generous scholar I have ever known. Although Dr. Gingrich-Philbrook was never officially one of my instructors, he's been a mentor to me in the 16 years since I obtained a PhD. I wouldn't have the courage to write what I write without Craig's gentle but convincing guidance. I am certainly not alone in my adoration of this wonderful, humble human being. I am proud and honored to interview my friend, Dr. Gingrich-Philbrook. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, Craig.
Ragan. It was a wonderful thing to be asked to consider doing this. And so I want to thank Tony and Keith and other folks associated with the conference for this opportunity. And I think that picking Ragan to be the person to interview me was a stroke of genius. So thank you for that.
So let's start with your early life and some relatively softball questions, because what I learned when I was taking qualitative research is you start with some of the easier questions, although maybe some of my beginning questions aren't too easy. Where were you born?
I was born in West Covina, California.
What was your mother's name?
Rochelle.
What was your father's name?
Paul. Although people called him Phil, which confused everybody. Thought his parents named him Phil Philbrook.
Your father passed away when you were 12. What do you remember most about your relationship with him?
Well, I've written about this, sort of extensively. It's interesting to me, kind of going back, how he is such an important figure in my work in a variety of different ways. What I remember most about our relationship, in the sense of the thing that is the most sustaining, is his willingness to entertain accepting me where I was. And when I say that, all I mean is that it wasn't as if, raising this queer kid, this sort of incipient queer kid, who I think he knew as such, wasn't without its challenges, but he was also a kind of kinder, gentler person, so to speak. And so I remember sitting with him, and he would get a big piece of paper out because he wanted to be an architect. So he had a lot of big rolls of paper left. He left school when he married my mom to sort of support a family, and became a telephone lineman, and would draw a car for a circus train and ask me what animal should be inside it. And a tiger, and he would draw a tiger in there and then move on to the next one. So that willingness to spend time and to nurture creativity.
Certain gentleness, it sounds like. Fatherhood and masculinity often emerge as themes in your work. In Family Values, for instance, seeking daddy's approval is the metaphor you use to describe autoethnographers' too frequent quest to validate their work in terms of more masculinely coded social science. What events in your childhood and adolescence draw you to these themes of daddy and masculinity?
Well, I think just the vacuum created by his death, and this sort of parade of would-be fathers in the form of stepfathers who sort of each wanted to remake the family in his own image, right? And really became a lesson for me in how patriarchy operates, in the sense that it is sort of the man's prerogative to remake the world in the home. In at least in some, in some ideologies, I don't mean that that's like literally true, but that people operate as if it's true. And so that sense of how increasingly arbitrary different versions of masculinity felt, I think would be one of the ways that enters. And then certainly just the kind of continuing subjection to homophobic violence, that has, marked me in some ways that I've written about too, bodily and in ways that endure to this day. So for example, my right foot is throbbing right now because it's very cold out and I've been walking in. So the story that I tell in Refreshment of being bashed and the older boys stomping up and down on my feet, wanting me to admit that I was queer, right? That lives with me kind of on a daily basis. And so it reminds me to ask that question with every step, as it were.
What kind of student were you in high school?
In high school, I was an iffy student, in the sense that I loved to learn. But I could be easily distracted by a struggling classmate or things at home or whatever. And so there were times when high school and in my early years in college where I had abysmal, there's a 0.5 GPA semester. That's the semester that, we have a man with a split personality in the house and, who's sort of terrorizing us, at home. But there it is, right? Kind of on the record. I would say that forensics is the thing that saved me, being able to get out of the house almost every weekend and to go and make meaning with friends, and listen to, performances of literature and spend time with people's persuasive speeches and learn about impromptu speaking and improvisation and elaboration and things like that. It was a godsend in all kinds of ways.
What were your favorite events in forensics?
To do, I would say impromptu. Impromptu. Just
now that's, to me, impromptu is the scariest of all the events. I'm curious what drew you specifically to impromptu.
All of it coming together in some new way, the opportunity to kind of throw open a door to insight and connection that was unexpected and unrehearsed. I wasn't one of those sort of canned impromptu speakers. It was all there in the moment. And so that sense of seeing pattern, right? And I think that it was that work of connecting, sort of three examples of some issue or some idea that really led to how I make performance, and the desire to connect things that might not seem connected. So it was just the thrill of that, I think, that that led me to like it the most. And I would also say it's the one that had the most impact on my body. And so what I mean by that is often after an impromptu speech, I would just sort of be trembling in my seat. And it wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't fear. It was I would say it was the shedding of corporeal habit in a way, of being in the presence of something I hadn't anticipated. And it's the same feeling that I often have when I'm watching stunning autoethnographic performance that takes me to experiences that I didn't expect or see coming.
Yeah, two of the themes that you mentioned in that response, I see emerge in your work quite often. And the first is an in the momentness and honoring what's in a moment. And then the second is your expert ability to synthesize seemingly disparate ideas. And I think those are both skills that you probably cut your teeth on in impromptu.
Very much
So
so.
let's shift into your education and your early career in autoethnography and in Almond Grove, which if any of you have not read this essay, I highly encourage you to do it. The first third of it is just breathtaking in your description of this Almond Grove. You talk about leaving Chico for Southern Illinois University's doctoral program. What made you decide I want to move to Carbondale in the late 1980s?
Well, like a lot of things in my life, I would say that it was a form of drift work, right? And so what I mean by that is my high school debate coach knew my junior college debate coach. And I went to Chico because I ran away from home and moved in with my grandparents. Now, if a 19-year-old person can be said to run away. And so I went to school there and found the debate team there. And my coach, I was an English major studying creative writing. And I think that's important in the sense of a literary background. But my coach, Isaac Catt, was a phenomenologist who had studied with Richard Lanigan here at SIU, and he said I should go, and I did. As a first-gen college person, I was very much dependent upon advisors and advice. I didn't know from kind of looking around. A curiosity in my background is that Ted Wendt, who some of my performance studies colleagues might know, was on my thesis committee, and I adored Ted. He was an extraordinary person, and then he kind of decided performance studies was making a terrible, kind of wrong turn. But he had suggested that I think about Northwestern, which just seemed ludicrous to me as a working class first gen kid. I couldn't imagine doing that. And so that's how I ended up here. And Isaac said, and so I did.
Performance studies making the wrong turn in terms of going from primarily performance of literature to a more expansive notion of like cultural text.
Yes, ethnography and autoethnography.
Who were some of your other mentors in the program?
At Chico?
Or at SIU?
Well, certainly when I first came here, Tom Pace and Ron Pelias and Jim Van Oosting, and their Paradigm for Performance Studies essay was still, pretty fresh in that time, and it had a profound impact upon me. A couple years, maybe after I'd been here for about 3 years, we got both Elise Pineau and Nathan Stuckey, and Elise's essay about Anais Nin, A Mirror of Her Own, had just come out, and I remember Scott Dillard and I reading it aloud in a car while Sharon Bebout was driving us back from a convention, and just kind of falling in love with this wonderful new professor, that we had found, and we became, co-travelers in this journey of solo autobiographical performance.
After obtaining your PhD in 1994, you moved to New York and took a job at Hofstra University, where you served as a forensics coach, assistant professor, and eventually associate dean. What brought you back to Carbondale in 1998?
That's such an interesting question, because I had just kind of begun to do performance artwork in the city and was really enjoying my association with Dixon Place, which is a kind of experimental theater there. It was a combination of things, I think. A certain amount of realization that of really what we might kind of think about the politics of location, in the sense that it was clear to me that my professional colleagues valued my performance at Dixon Place because of the address, because of the city that it was in, more than, say, a little theater that held about 50 people, more than, say, me going to present that same performance at, say, Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota to an audience of a couple hundred, that somehow the folks in New York were more valuable. And so I had a kind of diminishing sense of what we might think of as being the value, the alleged value of those spectators over other spectators. There was a new dean of the School of Communication who made war on Johnny and me. And so it was a very complicated situation for me at that kind of time. And they had the job here, and Elise emailed me and said, what did you think about it? And I had seen the job ad come out, and I thought, oh, well, people don't hire their own. But then when Elise did that, it felt like a lifeline. And so I swam toward it as if it were a door. And I'm glad I did. And I'm grateful to you, Elise, for that.
So let's talk about your autoethnographic work. You've written so many wonderful pieces. I always tell my students that it's better to dive deep on fewer topics than it is to merely scratch the surface of too many ideas. And in that spirit, I want to focus on some of your most significant contributions to autoethnography. And I'd like to start off with Autoethnography and an Almond Grove. In the opening of this essay, you vividly describe the almond grove your grandparents farmed and called home, from its beautiful nutty blossoms to its eventual destruction. Just as your grandparents destroyed part of an almond grove to build their home, the rest of their almond grove is eventually destroyed to build a neighborhood. Why open with this anecdote that animates a cycle of destruction and, for lack of better words, production?
That's an interesting question, in the sense that I think I don't know it necessarily if I can answer that in a way that suggests it was a sort of preformed, clear plan, right? In that sense, it's in its own way, it's more emergent. But another kind of answer would be that the way that groves work fascinates me, because they are sort of both tended and wild places. And so they are material deconstructions of that distinction. And so in that essay, what I'm doing is trying to work at the opposition between analytic and evocative autoethnography. And so I kind of talk about use the structure of the Almond Grove and the precision of the Almond Grove to think about the analytic, or at least as a kind of stand-in for the analytic in a way, and the wildness and the blossoms and the profusion and the interconnected wildlife, the pollinators, the ground squirrels, et cetera, as being, and the pleasure of walking out into it, as being kind of a stand-in for the evocative and how they are interdependent. And so that juxtaposition of those two aspects of the grove seemed to me to be a way to talk through that opposition of the analytic and the evocative, and to work to undo it, to a degree.
Yeah, I think also you play with the interconnected nature of kind of a lightness and a beauty, and how that interplays and intersects with darkness, and your description of how sometimes the trees are the darkest trees that you've ever seen, and then sometimes they have beautiful pink blossoms depending on the season. And certainly in a lot of autoethnography, we see that relationship between lightness and darkness. I'm taken by how the gorgeous narrative about the Almond Grove was written, put down for 10 years, and then picked up again for this essay. 10 years prior to this piece, you planted a seed and had to wait for the right moment for it to be cultivated. Can you speak more about the importance of timing and farming ideas and autoethnography? Because I do see you discuss temporality in relation to writing and experience a lot in your work.
Well, I think of time, and this is Tom Pace's influence on me. Time as an existential universal, which is to say we're all subject to time, but time isn't necessarily linear or one-dimensional. And when we think about narrative as a doubly anchored event, and the narrated event and the narrative event, the story told and the telling of the story, we're always sort of bridging like a spark, these sort of two poles, of moments. And because we tell stories sort of over and over again, and if we want to be, kind of Benjamini about it, and, we can talk about, how we reach back and seize hold of the past in a moment of danger, that there will almost, any time that I'm working on a story, the things that I reach back for are motivated by things happening in the present and, sort of connections with them. Either the story is kind of a decoder ring, so to speak, and kind of helps me understand the present, or the present helps me understand something in the story that I hadn't noticed before, or both, kind of in different ratio. And I think it's one of the reasons why some of the pieces we will kind of talk about the same incident or the same phenomenon and kind of rework them maybe a tiny little bit. So I think it's my sense of I tell people sometimes I'm not here very much. And what I mean by that is I'm not sort of here in the present very much, or in my body very much. I'm thinking a lot, or I'm remembering things, or there are, ideas and eidetic imagery happening, and I can forget, I'm very careful when I drive. I don't want anybody to worry about me. But I think, that sense of being kind of adrift in imagery, right? And so time is both the meat of the experience, but it's also something we have to learn to marshal when we're selecting and arranging events to tell a story. And so I think about, the things that us performance studies folks love about the performance of literature, and thinking about suspended time and equivalent time and condensed time in narrative. When we tell a story, and we take our time, or we're telling it and then kind of in real time. Or over the course of 10 years, I became a better person, right? And really kind of condensing, that. And that it's the, when we're selecting which of those to do and what to put in order, and just the lived experience of sort of downshifting out of equivalent time into suspended time, and then, kind of upshifting into condensed time, can show the emotional tenor or feel of the experience. And so time is very, very, very important, I guess, to me, and sort of in all of those ways.
Yeah, and certainly something that autoethnographers grapple with a lot in their work. How are you going to structurally or formally deal with time and communicate the passage of time, or the being here or being there? Or so you often focus on binaries or seemingly oppositional word pairs. If I were your therapist, I might ask, Craig, tell me about the binaries. And one of the binaries that you explore in the Almond Grove piece is what I'll call a complicated relationship between objectivity and subjectivity. You argue that critics demand autoethnography that takes us someplace we otherwise couldn't go, but also autoethnography that needs to stay tightly tethered to the relatable and generalizable. Otherwise, they're self-indulgent. Craig, why might this arbitrary label of self-indulgent, or in contemporary parlance, TMI, prove especially sensitive to queer autobiographical authors?
Well, I think it's, I feel like, we can go even, we could go to Goffman and Stigma and think about the ways that the so-called normals never have to explain, but any stigmatized identity that speaks anything is sort of doing too much, right? I asked students to read a couple essays about autoethnographic documentary in class last semester. And in one of them, a person talks about autoethnography being critiqued because it's emotionally incontinent, as if, being a good subject was essentially equivalent to being a good sphincter and, kind of keeping it all inside, right? And so that boundary of the, the personal and the public, the personal and the political, the, abjection, leaky bodies, we can, ability and disability, we can talk about a variety of ways that kind of name calling, so to speak, around indulgence functions as a stopper, functions as a silencer, right? And is precisely the ways that a lot of experiences are constructed as unknowable, or things we can't identify with or shouldn't identify with. Whereas to speak of these things openly, plainly, clearly, as we attempt to do in autoethnography, and meaningfully connecting them to these sort of larger cultural contexts, is a way to show others what might be possible, and that they're not alone. And all of the things that we say about providing hope and giving people the opportunity to reflect. And not just for the people who also identify with those stories. Norm said something really beautiful in the session today, that that this kind of writing becomes a means for the reader's own moral experiences. And I think so often when people say, oh, that's just therapy, or, oh, that person's being self-indulgent, what they're saying is that they don't recognize anything in it. And so it is not about them. And because it is not about them, the person saying the thing is the wrong one. And that's a bizarre thing to put into motion and to naturalize, because it says so much more about the person hurling that accusation and the limited capacity that they have for empathy than it does for the person who's merely speaking the truth about their life.
I wanted to read my favorite bit from Autoethnography and an Almond Grove. You write, although it makes friends from elsewhere laugh, I will sometimes still say the word almonds the right way, which is to say the local way, almonds. According to Chico's newspaper, The Enterprise Record, according to Webster's dictionary, either pronunciation is acceptable. They even report that it's nearly impossible to spend a few days in Chico without hearing the old painful pun, they're almonds when they're on the branch, but on the ground, they're almonds because the farmers knocked the L out of them. Belonging to Chico, or at least to the memory of the Grove, still matters to me. I am, in 2 words, not me without the almond trees. Really fabulous card. Let's move to On Dorian Street. This piece is a reflection of home as a place to hang one's head. You chronicle your relationship with your mother and the many abusive men in both of your lives. Did you keep a diary during this period?
During that period, I have an extraordinary pen pal relationship with an older gay man in Indianapolis, who I meet through a personal ad in the New York Review of Books. And he very sweetly and kindly writes back to this, 17-year-old kid, states and states and states away for years. And he's the one actually who recommended that I begin reading Joan Didion. So I have Bruce to thank for that. And so I think of my letters during that period to him as the closest thing that I have to a journal of that time. And certainly I'm writing a lot of poetry about my experience, but not a journal per se.
What's the significance of the rusting swing set in the yard?
That house had a pile of a dilapidated swing set in the side yard. And it had a piece of metal pipe that was the triangle on the swing set has that strut kind of connecting the two things to keep it together. And so that is what I went and found to keep by the door for when my mom's men would come and demand to see her and bang on the door. One in particular, kind of over and over again after she'd broken up with him. And so it's the thing that was a stabilizer that in that story becomes something different. And that I kept it there by the door, as this young person, at 12, when your father dies and everybody starts calling you the man of the house, that's quite an odd thing to try to experience and figure out what that means, right? And so for me, part of what it meant was protecting them. And so that's how the pipe gets there.
Yeah, it makes me think about how so many of us have had to fashion tools of child's play into weapons of self-defense and defending the things that we love. You recently published one of my essays in which I caution autoethnographers to wait a bit before diving into emotionally triggering episodes. In Dorian Street, you offer a compelling counterpoint to the too soon refrain. What is this counterpoint?
Well, I think when we say to people that you shouldn't write too soon, part of that imagines this moment, like the butterball turkey thing popping up to say, hey, book is done. And there isn't a moment like that. It's always a construction or a realization after the fact, I think, when we're writing. And as I say in that essay, when we write in the midst of the flaming debris field, it isn't as if that the experiences that we recount in that writing are immaterial or merely false. And if we let those go away and evaporate, we're also losing some lived experience, and we're also losing some reality. We may want to go back and look again at a later point, as I think so many are doing right now. I think Tammy, kind of in particular, not in her most recent book, but in the one before that, is doing a lot of that work. I know Elise has done that, with Nursing Mother. And that is also good, right? When sort of normal science folks elaborate a paradigm, they do get to go back and correct it. That's a thing that people do. It's not shameful. And so to be able to encourage people to note the experience on the hoof seems important to me in some important ways. It's important in some important ways.
One of the things that strikes me about Dorian Street is how you document the ways in which home is not always a safe space, and how the assumption of it being a safe space results in devastating institutional failures, such as the police calling your mom instead of doing a home check in the midst of a horrific, deadly act of domestic violence. I can almost hear them saying to one another, the police officers, hey, it's a domestic dispute. We don't want to get too involved in this sort of thing. What role does autoethnography play in documenting institutional failures like the one you describe On Dorian Street?
Well, I think, at one level, it's sort of right there in the question. It documents them. And I think it's, I think about how our attention has been shaped by video shared on Facebook and so on. Just for example, around the phenomenon, particularly with people of color, although not exclusively, when people call because of a mental illness episode and someone's in real trouble, and what happens is that the police come and they kill that person. Mm-hmm. Right? We attend to that. That documentation has constructed that as an iterable moment, as a moment that we recognize as such, as part of a pattern of a variety of perceptual and ideological failures, right? And I think that what we do in autoethnography is, when we're also documenting those failures, is saying, hey, wait a minute, here's a phenomenon. I will attest to the reality of this phenomenon, and whether that's in an evocative count like me, where it can sort of jog like I do, or it will jog somebody's thought process, or it's in a more actionable kind of multiple autoethnographic or social science thing where we try to gather a variety of such stories, right? I think it's important for us to do that because that's the way that we show. Well, and kind of a beautiful thing that Allison said in an earlier session about, let's see, from James Baldwin, the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers, right? There are these taken for granteds of ideology that hide the real questions. Is this really working, right? Do the police really care about women? When I call them from hundreds of miles away and say that I heard her cry for help when I was on the phone, and they call to ask if she's all right, and my stepfather has a gun to her head, of course she says she's fine, right? She has to wait until he passes out to get away and, calls me back. And so that's kind of part of the account and just the variety of things that being in that house to take it apart after her death called to mind. So kind of in that piece.
Yeah, and at the end of the piece where you talk about kind of taking inventory of things in the home and cleaning things out, I thought, wow, that's really, nobody enjoys doing that per se after they lose somebody that they love, but it's often necessary work to help. It's part of the grieving process, right? On Gratitude for My Father, you discuss your complicated relationship with mint. What might your relationship with mint teach autoethnographers?
Well, so in that piece, I tell the story of I'm outside when my father has his brain hemorrhage. He's using a chainsaw with my grandfather to cut up some firewood. And I have a piece of mint from the planter that I'm kind of biting into just as he falls. And I watch him fall kind of just in that moment. And so for decades, the taste of mint would bring that moment back to me. And so watermelon toothpaste, like just, so it became this, this aversion, kind of when we sort of think about it, from a, potentially a sort of Buddhist standpoint, and a story that I kind of got myself locked into. It's true that it did that, but it didn't always have to do that. And there's something about telling the story over and over to myself that preserved that power. And so the kind of loosening of that, one summer where, my husband, Johnny, has a big mint patch in the front yard, and I'm experimenting with it, and I'm trying to kind of make my peace with mint, and
like a planned exposure.
Yeah, right. To sort of work out of that story, the inevitability of that association with mint, without losing that ability to describe how the body remembers.
There's this contrivance in RuPaul's Drag Race, but it gets me every single season that they do it. And it's at the end where RuPaul takes out a picture of one of the finalists when they were super young and says, "What piece of advice would you give to this kid?" And I cry every single time. And to me, this piece, the On Gratitude for My Father, is you talking to that younger version of yourself. And there is one section of it that really knocked the wind out of me. And you write, I might not get this perfect, but I don't remember what came first, the chicken or the cake. And I was wondering if you could share that experience with us.
When I'm in fourth grade, I believe it's either fourth or fifth grade, my mom just it's fourth grade, because my teacher decides I'm not being socialized correctly because I'm spending too much time with the girls. And so they put me in Little League, and oh my God, horrific experience. But and mom makes a slumber party for me. So these boys who call me Sissy at school all come to the house. And two things happen at that slumber party. One is that they tie me to a board in the grass at twilight, and I'll go away to play in the barn. And I look over, and my chicken, Red, is dead in the grass. I don't think that they killed her. I think she just happened to be there. And so I'm tied there in this kind of growing dark, next to the body of my friend, as I say in the piece. And the other thing is that when we're having cake, my dad comes around behind me and pushes my face down into my cake. And I don't remember which of those came first. And so partly what I'm doing in the essay is saying, we have these flashbulb memories, and being honest about not knowing their order is part of the truth telling about how they live in our bodies and come to us. And so it's partly my effort to say, hey, it's okay to say what we don't know. When I tell the story about the boys in my feet, I say, I don't know how many of them there were. There were more than 3. There were probably less than 7. I don't know. And the not knowing says something about dissociating in that moment, about not believing that I had the opportunity to tell that story to a school official. And so it would be important to know how many there were, because no school official would respond, right? It just never occurred to me, right? And so I think that that's when I say I don't remember what came first, the chicken or the cake, I'm putting those stories into the world as they are in my body, which is to say in an uncertain temporal relationship to each other.
The beautiful open-endedness of autoethnography, because my takeaway from those anecdotes is so different. My big takeaway was that your father being jocular, not realizing this traumatic event that either happens before or after your face gets pressed in the cake, is that despite his lack of knowledge, these acts don't exist in a vacuum, that they are nodes in the same network that are mutually reinforcing and teach you lessons about masculinity and sexuality. And so what may seem like a discrete event to your father that's disconnected and may not have that much of an impact, to you does. And so one of the things that I grapple with when I try to point out instances of homophobia, say at my institution, is that I have to explain and do the emotional labor of saying, this thing that you've said at a faculty meeting or, you know, in my office is not by itself. That this is part of a greater context of stuff that I have to deal with every day. So we're getting a little short on time, and I do want to do these closing questions because they're always my favorite part of Inside the Actors Studio. What's your favorite scholarly word?
Deconstruction.
What is your least favorite scholarly word?
Performative, when used incorrectly.
What about academia turns you on?
Being among other bodies who are speaking interesting ideas.
What about academia turns you off?
Too many of those bodies at one time.
Me too, me too. What sound or noise do you love?
Donut purring.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Something backing up.
Like the beep, beep. Danger.
Yeah.
What is your favorite curse word?
Pig fucker.
Have you seen that episode of Black Mirror?
Yes.
Okay. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Ichthyology.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. What profession would you not like to do?
Lawyer.
After you retire, how would you like the next generation to describe your work?
Enabling, in the sense that it helped them do a thing.
That it helped them do a thing? Yeah, well, I mean, before we go on to questions and comments, I do want to say that it, you know, I was already quite familiar with your work, obviously, before I agreed to do this panel. But then when I took up the charge, I did an even deeper dive. And as you know, on Facebook, just reading your work has inspired me so much this week. I've been so productive in my writing, and reading your work just makes me go, oh, I want to be, I want to get to Craig's level of writing and description. And so luckily for you, you don't have to wait until you retire to know that your work is quite generative.
Thanks, Ragan.
So we wanted to have time left over to go into the audience, because there are quite a few people here who love Craig, and other people who may have questions about him and his work. So if you want to raise your hand. Keith.
That was an amazing 50 minutes that I wish could keep going. And so I'll be very brief, because I'm sure there are tons of folk that want to say something. Thank you, Craig, for years ago being the first person who taught me that the word queer can mean something safer than it is usually meant when it's hurled at me. I would have never imagined that I would do queer work, and you are a prime reason for that. What do you think the Trump era has done for queer autoethnographers seeking to amplify our voices? That's a big question, but anything come to mind?
What we let it do, right? What we take from it, how we speak back and call them on their pretense, right? And in a very similar way, I would say to Ragan, he was a monster. He's a monster. He's a monster.
Elise.
Just first, thank you, because I get to work with Craig every day. He's been so woven into my everydayness of professional life, and you know what a joy clearly hearing him speak. Craig, early on, you talked about the importance of coming from an English major creative writing background. I know you've spoken about that often in your work. If this feels like a moment that you would want to circle back to that, the literary, the artistic as part of your activist practice, if that feels important to you, to give you the opportunity to.
Sure. I believe that poets and novelists writing about their work and how they fashion things for moments is very important. So just as an example of that, because of time, when William Carlos Williams is writing about poetry, and he says no ideas but in things, before Husserl says back to the things themselves, they're coming from a very similar place, right? In relationship to calling upon us to exercise a certain amount of attentiveness to detail. And so I would say that reading poets and novelists writing about the construction of moments for years and years was a very important part of what prepared me, for this. And I would certainly put Didion in that camp. She does it less in like a craft essay, right? And it's more kind of meta within the work itself. And so that, I think, is a big influence on me too, right? It provides an architecture of recognizability to theory that sometimes is the place where I get kind of itchy and want to say, you're not the first person to say this. Please go read these nice other people too.
Other questions or people who want to love on Craig?
And Ragan, I think we have time for one more, because we have a bit more of a setup for the next session. Just to let. Thank you.
Elise. Oh, you're muted.
Do you want to say anything about your music and music composition practice, Craig? I know that that's very much of the kind of art that you're engaged with right now.
I guess I would just say that, first of all, what I really want to do is to thank Katrina and David for being people who speak so wonderfully about music. It's always really encouraging to me. I do a kind of strange experimental stuff that's very different, but I think what in the tiny little bit of town time that we have, I would just say working in another medium is a way to ask and answer formal questions from a metaphoric perspective about the other medium that we like. And so, because I'm so interested in selection and arrangement, certainly music helps me exercise that question. And that, I think, helps me think about rhythm in storytelling in a different way, the voice in performance. And so it's been an enriching experience to think in another medium.
Well, thank you all very much for attending this session. It's been a complete pleasure. The best part of this for me was getting to spend even more time with Craig, because I cherish every moment that we get to talk. And I hope the rest of your conference is amazing, and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.